Welcome to Truth Behind History. The stories are real, the impact is lasting. Today, we're diving into a moment when the United States didn't just change its foreign policy, it redrew its place in the world. This is the story of how America stepped onto the global stage not just as a republic, but as an empire. So let me ask you this: what happens when a nation founded on anti-imperial rebellion starts building an empire of its own? That's the tension at the heart of this story, and it begins in 1898. The Spanish-American War was short, but its consequences were massive. In just a few months, the United States defeated a crumbling Spanish empire and suddenly found itself in possession of overseas territories. Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines. These weren't just dots on a map, they were symbols of a new identity. The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1898, wasn't just an end to conflict. It was a beginning of American imperialism. And this transformation wasn't accidental. It was strategic. Economic interests, military ambitions, and a growing belief in American exceptionalism all collided in this moment. The US was no longer content to look inward. Now it looked outward, toward the Pacific, the Caribbean, and beyond. But military conquest alone doesn't guarantee influence. So how did the US justify this new reach? Enter the Roosevelt corollary. The original Monroe Doctrine, from the early 1800s, warned European powers to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. It was defensive, but in the hands of Theodore Roosevelt, that doctrine evolved aggressively. The Roosevelt corollary declared that the United States had not just the right, but the responsibility to intervene in Latin American countries if their stability was threatened. Stability, of course, being a very flexible term. What followed wasn't just diplomacy, it was occupation, control, and a growing sense that America had appointed itself the guardian of the hemisphere. This was the moment when foreign policy became a tool for empire. And the consequences? Well, they're still unfolding more than a century later. Let's explore how. Now let's talk about something that sounds almost silly at first: bananas. But trust me, this isn't about smoothies or breakfast. This is about power, and how something as simple as a fruit became a symbol of foreign control, economic manipulation, and lost sovereignty. After the Spanish-American War, the United States wasn't just expanding its flag, it was expanding its businesses, especially in Central America. And one of the most powerful players in this new game? The United Fruit Company. Now, United Fruit wasn't just some innocent agricultural business. It operated more like a shadow government. It bought up huge tracts of land, often the most fertile, and paid almost nothing in taxes. But how did it keep that grip? Here's where things get interesting. These companies didn't work alone. They were backed, explicitly or implicitly, by the US government and military. This is what we call the corporate-military nexus. Imagine needing soldiers to protect your bananas. Sounds ridiculous, right? But in reality, US fruit companies lobbied Washington for help whenever local governments threatened their profits, whether by pushing for land reform, higher wages, or simply national autonomy. The term banana republic came from this very dynamic. It describes a country whose economy, and often its politics, are entirely shaped by the needs of foreign businesses. These weren't democracies in any meaningful sense. They were fragile, corrupt, and dependent. And the benefits? They flowed upward, to elites who cooperated with the foreign powers, while the rest of the population remained stuck in poverty. This leads us to something called export monoculture. That's when a country depends almost entirely on one crop, in this case, bananas, for its income. Now think about the risks of that. If banana prices fall, the economy crashes. If workers organize or resist, the military intervenes. There's no diversity, no stability, and certainly no path for broad-based development. So while Americans were eating cheap fruit, entire nations were being economically engineered to serve a single export. And behind the scenes, it was less about fruit and more about control. But this wasn't the end of the story. This was just the beginning of a much more aggressive phase, one that involved boots on the ground and flags planted in the name of order. Now we move into the part of the story where diplomacy ends and the boots hit the ground. Between 1903 and 1934, the United States carried out a series of direct military interventions across Latin America. We're talking about invasions in Honduras, Nicaragua, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, countries that, on paper, were sovereign nations. But in practice, they became occupied zones under US control, all under the justification of stabilizing the region. But here's the question: stabilizing for whom? These invasions weren't just about keeping the peace. They were about creating conditions that served American strategic and economic interests. Local governments that challenged US influence, or tried to nationalize resources, were replaced by more compliant regimes. That's a nice way of saying puppet governments. Leaders who owed their power to Washington, not to the people they claimed to represent. And once those governments were in place, the influence didn't stop at the presidential palace. This is where the term institutional capture comes in. See, with a military presence on the ground, the US could exert control over courts, police forces, banks, and even education systems. Institutions that were supposed to serve the local population were instead re-engineered to facilitate resource extraction and suppress resistance. So, imagine being a citizen in your own country, but your schools teach a foreign narrative, your leaders serve foreign interests, and your economy is structured to export wealth, not build it. That's not just interference, that's structural dominance. And make no mistake, this wasn't some secret conspiracy. It was US policy, proudly declared in speeches, newspapers, and government memos. These occupations weren't short-term missions. In Haiti, for example, the US stayed for nearly 2 decades. In Nicaragua, American influence would shape politics long after the troops left. This wasn't nation-building, it was empire maintenance, just without calling it that. But interventions on this scale always have consequences. Some intended, many not, and the fallout would shape Latin America for generations. Next, we'll explore what happens when you try to control entire nations, and the system starts pushing back. Let's talk about incentives and unintended consequences. Alright, so we've seen how US intervention was often sold as stabilization, but underneath the surface, it was about control. But here's the thing about control, especially when it's forced. It never comes without a backlash. Let's start with the most immediate one, nationalist resistance. Across Latin America, people weren't blind to what was happening. They saw the soldiers, the puppet regimes, the disappearing autonomy, and they responded. Movements emerged. Some were peaceful, others were armed. But the message was clear: we don't want to be ruled from Washington. This is what we call nationalist backlash. And it wasn't just a reaction to military presence, it was a cultural rejection of foreign domination. In country after country, anti-American sentiment began to rise. People didn't just resist occupation, they resisted the entire ideology behind it. And who could blame them? Now, let's go deeper. Beyond the protests and uprisings, there were institutional consequences. Less visible, but arguably more damaging in the long run. When a country becomes dependent on foreign capital, and its laws are written to serve outsiders, what happens to its local governance? It erodes. Slowly but surely, the rule of law bends to external pressure. Local institutions, already fragile, become even weaker. This is called institutional erosion. And once you reach that point, rebuilding trust becomes nearly impossible. Citizens stop believing in courts, elections, even public services, because everything feels captured, rigged, not for them. But perhaps the most insidious part of all this is what we call corporate-state conflation. That's when national interests and private business agendas become so entangled that they're indistinguishable. US foreign policy wasn't just about protecting democracy, it was about protecting fruit companies, oil interests, and shipping lanes. And when those goals aligned, it was easy to justify intervention. But when they didn't, democracy usually lost. So ask yourself, what happens when a nation uses its military not just to protect its people, but to secure the profits of its corporations abroad? What happens when the state becomes an extension of the market? That's the paradox. The interventions were supposed to bring order, but they often produced resistance, instability, and resentment that made long-term peace even harder to achieve. Now, the United States would eventually recognize that sending in the Marines over and over again was creating more problems than it solved. But instead of stepping back, it changed tactics. By the early 1930s, even Washington was starting to realize something: you can only occupy a country for so long before the costs outweigh the benefits. The world was changing. Colonialism was losing its shine, anti-imperialist movements were gaining traction, and the sight of American troops marching through foreign streets was becoming, well, bad PR. So, what did the United States do? Did it pull out entirely and let these nations determine their own futures? Not exactly. Instead, it rebranded. In 1933, President Franklin Roosevelt announced the Good Neighbor policy. It sounded friendly enough, like something you'd see on a local HOA flyer. But behind the warm wording was a strategic shift. The US would no longer intervene openly in the internal affairs of Latin American countries. No more overt invasions, no more boots on the ground, at least, not in the same way. But here's the catch: just because the Marines packed up doesn't mean influence ended. It just got quieter. Enter the CIA. During the Cold War, US intervention evolved. The Banana Wars may have ended, but covert operations took their place. Instead of sending soldiers, America sent agents. Instead of occupying countries, it funded coups. One of the most infamous examples? Guatemala, 1954. The democratically elected president, Jacobo Arbenz, tried to redistribute land, much of it unused territory held by the United Fruit Company. You can imagine how that went over in Washington. The CIA launched a covert operation to remove him. Propaganda, economic pressure, and a small rebel force did the trick. Arbenz was gone, and a military dictatorship took his place. It wasn't war, it was invisible war. And it worked. The goals hadn't changed: protect American interests, suppress leftist movements, and maintain influence in the region. But now, it all happened behind the scenes. Less bloody in the short term, but often more damaging in the long run. This is the rise of soft power. Influence without occupation. It includes economic pressure, intelligence operations, diplomacy, trade agreements, and media influence. On paper, it looks more peaceful, but in reality, it still shaped who held power, who got crushed, and who got left behind. So yes, the banana wars ended, but the strategy simply evolved. And now we have to ask a deeper question: was all of this worth it? Who actually benefited from this long history of intervention, and who paid the price? Let's pause, because up until now, we've talked about strategies, invasions, corporations, and covert ops, but we haven't really talked about people, about the human cost, the families, the workers, the young leaders who tried to reform their countries and ended up in exile, or worse. So let's ask the real questions. Who benefited from these interventions? Well, the answer's not that complicated. US corporations gained cheap land, low labor costs, and guaranteed market dominance. American banks got repaid, often at the expense of local economies. And politically, US policymakers could boast about fighting instability or communism, even as they propped up authoritarian regimes. But who paid? The citizens of Latin America, the farmers whose land was seized or devalued, the workers who were underpaid and overworked, the families caught between foreign troops and local militias, the reformers who dared to challenge the system and were branded as threats. This wasn't a fair trade. It was a transfer of wealth, of autonomy, of future possibilities. And here's the most haunting part: we'll never know what might have been. What if these nations had been left to evolve on their own terms? What kind of political systems could they have developed? What kinds of economies, cultures, or institutions might have emerged if they hadn't been shaped by outside pressure? We talk about stability as if it's always good, but stability for whom? Sometimes, what gets called stability is really just entrenched control, frozen inequality. And sometimes, what's dismissed as chaos is actually the sound of people struggling for a better life. So let's reframe the question. What if instead of intervention, there had been cooperation? Instead of coercion, consent? Instead of propping up the status quo, a chance to build something new, from the ground up? What if these nations had been treated as equals, not pawns? Now we're not rewriting history here, but we are trying to learn from it, because the choices made then still echo now. And those echoes? They're loudest in the very places where this story unfolded. The banana wars may be over, but their fingerprints are everywhere. Look at modern Latin America, and you'll see scars that haven't fully healed. In many countries, political distrust runs deep, not because people are cynical by nature, but because for decades, they watched foreign powers shape their destiny more than their own ballots ever could. And that memory, it doesn't just fade, it becomes generational. Many of the nations that were occupied or manipulated during the banana wars still struggle with fragile institutions. Corruption remains a serious challenge. Inequality runs deep, and populist leaders, on both the left and the right, often rise by invoking one powerful message: we will finally stand up to the empire. Because here's the thing, even when the soldiers left, the systems they built didn't. Economic dependence on exports? Still common. Elites who align more with foreign investors than local needs? Still a problem. And that idea of soft power, well, it's gone digital now. Trade agreements, loan conditions, media narratives, even algorithmic influence, these are the new tools of persuasion. And guess what? They still come with strings attached. But let's zoom out. This isn't just a Latin American story. This is a story about systems of control, how they evolve, how they justify themselves, and how they adapt when called out. The banana wars taught the US something valuable. Direct occupation is messy. It invites resistance, but shaping outcomes quietly, through economics, intelligence, and diplomacy. That works much better, at least if your goal is influence without accountability. So ask yourself, what systems in today's world are carrying forward the legacy of those wars? What alliances, financial systems, or institutions continue to operate on the assumption that some nations should lead, while others should follow? Because history doesn't just repeat, it mutates. And if we're not careful, we'll keep fighting old wars with new tools, calling it peace, and wondering why resentment keeps boiling just beneath the surface. So here we are, at the end of a story that spanned over 3 decades of conflict, control, and quiet coercion. But really, we're not at the end at all. Because the banana wars? They're not just about history. They're a mirror. They show us how empires don't always announce themselves. Sometimes they arrive with contracts instead of cannons, with sugar instead of swords. They show us how language can sanitize domination. Phrases like restoring order, protecting interests, or ensuring stability are used to justify all kinds of actions. But beneath the euphemisms, you often find a very old dynamic: power imposed from above, profit funneled outward, and voices from below left unheard. That's the tension at the heart of this story, between force and freedom, between central control and local agency. And here's the uncomfortable truth: many of the institutions and systems we take for granted today were shaped by these early interventions. Borders were redrawn, markets were rigged, leaders were installed not by the people, but by distant powers who believed they knew better. But history also shows us that people push back, they remember, they organize, they reclaim. And maybe that's the real lesson here, that control, no matter how sophisticated, is always temporary. But the consequences? They linger. In policy, in culture, in memory. So as we look around our world today, at economic inequality, at rising authoritarianism, at the uneasy alliances between state power and corporate wealth, we have to ask, are we seeing something new, or something old wearing a new mask? History won't give us all the answers, but it gives us better questions, and the courage to ask them. Thanks for watching Truth Behind History. If you found this video eye-opening, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And don't forget to check out the podcast version of this episode, links in the description. If you enjoy thoughtful, entertaining history content that doesn't pull punches, you're in the right place. Stick around, explore other videos, and keep asking the deeper questions, because sometimes, the truth behind history is the key to understanding the world we're in now.